We've all seen the image, a lone warrior silhouetted against the rising sun. His armor gleams. His katana reflects divine purpose. He bows not to a man but to a code. This is the samurai, or at least the version history wants you to remember. But behind the myth is a mask. And behind that mask is something darker, something colder. The samurai were not born as noble defenders of honor. They were born from chaos, a military class forged in civil war, famine, and lawless bloodshed. For centuries they didn't live by a code, they lived by the sword. Their loyalty wasn't to the people. It was to the highest bidder, the strongest clan, or the lord who promised the most land. The romantic image of the samurai, loyal, principled, spiritually enlightened, is not ancient truth. It's modern construction. The term Bushido, the sacred code we attach to them, wasn't even systematized until the Edo period, long after the real wars had ended. The sword of the warrior had been sheathed, and so the story was rewritten. They were rebranded as moral icons, cultural treasures. Not because they had changed, but because Japan needed them to symbolize discipline and sacrifice in a new era of order. But what happens when you look beneath the script? You see not the haiku writing ascetic, but a warlord's enforcer. You see scorched villages, severed heads displayed like trophies, and bodies desecrated as proof of merit. The samurai did not rise by virtue. They rose by violence. Their legacy was written in blood long before it was rewritten in ink. So why do we still believe the myth? Because we want to. We need to. In a world full of moral compromise and quiet submission, the idea of the disciplined, fearless warrior comforts us. It gives shape to a virtue we wish we had. But that comfort comes at a cost. It blinds us to truth. And the truth is this: the samurai were not gods. They were not monsters. They were men, capable of poetry, yes, but also of cruelty beyond comprehension. And to understand their story, we must be willing to confront both. Not with reverence, but with our eyes open. September 1571. The sacred slopes of Mount Hiei glowed, not with divine presence but with fire. Temples burned. Sutras turned to ash. And beneath the black smoke, monks, women, and children screamed as samurai blades tore through robes, flesh, and bone. This wasn't war. This was execution on sacred ground. Oda Nobunaga, hailed as one of Japan's great unifiers, had ordered the annihilation of the Enryakuji monastery. Why? Because it stood in his way. Thousands of warrior monks had lived there. But they weren't all warriors. Some were scholars. Some were children. Some had never held a weapon in their lives. No matter. The mountain was encircled, the exit sealed, and the killing began. Survivors ran barefoot through thorns and blood, only to be cut down in flight. Soldiers competed to take the most heads, not out of hate but ambition. Every skull handed to Nobunaga brought reward: land, rank, gold. The more respected the head, the greater the prize. So soldiers learned to lie. They dress up peasants as monks, paint faces, fake robes, anything to convince their lord they had killed someone of importance. What mattered wasn't the truth. What mattered was the show. This wasn't an isolated madness. It was a system. Violence had rules and rewards. Fast forward 2 decades, to the Japanese invasion of Korea in 1592. This time the stage was Busan. One samurai, Yoshino Jingozeman, wrote proudly in his diary, "We cut down everyone, men, women, even children, as a sacrifice to the god of war." Even animals weren't spared. Cats, dogs, butchered like trophies. In one campaign alone, over 85,000 people were slaughtered. Samurai didn't just kill to win. They killed to be seen. They carried severed noses and ears in sacks, presenting them as proof of conquest. The trophies were sent back to Japan and buried in mounds called mimizuka, ear tombs. Monuments not to honor, but to mutilation. And still today we call them noble. Mount Hiei, Busan, Mimizuka. Names that should be etched in shame, not glory. The samurai were not just soldiers. They were architects of atrocity. They killed with precision, yes, but also with pride. And for all the poetry and ritual we associate with them, their legacy, when stripped of polish, is one soaked in blood. We imagine the samurai's death as noble, serene, dignified, wrapped in the silence of cherry blossoms. But death in the samurai world was not always quiet. It was often a performance, bloody, theatrical, and grotesquely admired. The most famous of these was seppuku, ritual suicide by disembowelment. A sharp blade, a slow cut across the belly. Blood pours. Intestines spill. The warrior does not scream. He bows, accepts, dies with a whisper on his lips. Or so the myth says. In truth, seppuku was rarely peaceful. It was agony, screaming, shaking. Most begged their kaishakunin, the second, to strike quickly, to take their head before the pain overwhelmed them. And sometimes there was no second. No sword to end the suffering. Just a man, left to bleed out alone, gurgling in the dirt. This wasn't just a personal choice. It was often forced, a tool of control. A lord could order a subordinate to kill himself, and refusal meant disgrace, or execution anyway. Dying with honor was sometimes just a more photogenic way to be murdered. But even more chilling were the non-ritualized deaths, the ones stripped of poetry. After battles, samurai would scramble through piles of bodies to cut off heads, or if short on time, ears, noses, even hands, whatever could be presented as proof of valor. Bloody trophies stacked and catalogued like prizes. Some even faked them, dressing corpses in fake armor to elevate their rank. Others would team up. One holds down a wounded enemy while the other slices fast, before a rival could steal the claim. The battlefield was a marketplace of death. Each head had a price. Each severed part, currency. And in Korea, this grotesque economy evolved further. Since transporting heads was difficult, ears and noses became substitutes. Thousands were chopped, salted, packed, and sent home across the sea. These were not trophies of defense. These were records of slaughter. Industrialized, proud, and systematic. Even executions were ritualized. Crosses, spears, beheadings in public squares. Death became theater, a performance of power meant to instill obedience. The samurai weren't just warriors. They were actors in a bloody drama, sometimes heroes, often executioners. And behind every clean sword hung the stench of what it took to earn it. When the wars ended, the swords were not put down. They were simply pointed inward. The Edo period, more than 250 years of supposed peace under Tokugawa rule, is often portrayed as a golden age. No large-scale wars. A flourishing of art, culture, tea ceremonies, and poetry. But beneath the surface was another kind of violence, quieter, colder, and far more methodical. With no battles left to fight, the samurai reinvented themselves, not as warriors but as enforcers, judges, tax collectors, executioners. They ruled not through courage but through control, through fear. The peace was a cage. Strict social hierarchies locked everyone into place, samurai at the top, peasants beneath, and merchants lowest of all. Any hint of rebellion was met with brutal suppression. Public executions became a spectacle. Beheadings, burnings, crucifixions, even flaying alive. Crimes as petty as theft, blasphemy, or questioning authority could earn you a death sentence. The logic was simple: terror is order. And it was applied even to the innocent. Take the case of Toyotomi Hidetsugu. Once named heir to one of Japan's most powerful lords, he was forced to commit seppuku when his uncle, Hideyoshi, had a late-born son. But that wasn't enough. Dozens of his relatives, wives, concubines, children, were rounded up and executed. Toddlers beheaded. Infants starved. Bloodlines wiped clean like ink from parchment. Why? Because any potential threat, no matter how young, was unacceptable. And it wasn't just political. Belief itself became dangerous. In 1597, 26 Christians, including children, were crucified in Nagasaki. Their ears and noses sliced off. Their bodies speared while nailed to crosses. Not because they plotted a rebellion, but because their faith came from foreign lands. It was a warning: loyalty belongs to the state, not to God. This was the peace the samurai maintained, not the absence of war but the perfection of obedience. No battlefield, no duel, no honor. Just bureaucracy sharpened into a blade. And so the samurai became a paradox. They wore silk and recited poetry. But with a single command they could destroy a family, silence a village, or kill a child, not for glory but for order. Because in this new era, power didn't need war. It only needed silence. The samurai is more than a historical figure now. He's a symbol, carved into films, games, museums, and memory. But whose memory? Ours, the modern audience, who wants to believe in something noble even when it was born of blood. Because let's be honest, we don't worship the samurai for what they truly were. We worship them for what we wish they were. For what they represent in a world that often feels powerless, fragmented, and numb. We crave the idea of unwavering loyalty, of discipline in chaos, of a man who will die for something, anything, that feels meaningful. In the chaos of today, the myth of the samurai offers structure, certainty, even beauty. But that's the danger of nostalgia. It forgets the cries of children beneath burning temples. It ignores the sackcloth women forced to parade before their executioners. It glosses over the bureaucratic slaughter carried out not by monsters, but by men in robes and top-knots, reciting poetry as they stamp death warrants. And yet, we are still drawn to them. Just as we admire European knights, despite their brutal crusades, or venerate Viking warriors, despite their raids and enslavement. There's something primal in us, a yearning for power, for purpose, for that clean line between right and wrong. But the samurai lived in the blur. They were poets and killers, disciples of beauty and enforcers of silence. They held codes of honor in one hand and severed heads in the other. Bushido? That sacred code? It was never a constant truth. It was a post-war invention, formalized long after the blood had dried. It wasn't lived. It was taught, marketed, mythologized. A weapon of culture, not of war. So how should we see the samurai? Not as monsters, not as saints, but as human, forged by the furnace of their time, hardened by violence, softened occasionally by art. They should not be hated, but they should not be worshipped blindly either, because history is not a shrine, it is a mirror. And when we look into the eyes of the samurai, truly look, we don't just see Japan's past. We see our own longing for strength, our own struggle with power, and the cost we're willing to ignore when the myth is more beautiful than the truth.